Around 2003, I began teaching an introduction to what's now called media ecology. It's a discipline that asks how the human environment changes due to the introduction or removal of a new medium. And so that informed the two little books that I wrote, Why Johnny Can't Preach, The Media Have Shaped the Messengers, and Why Johnny Can't Sing Hymns, How Pop Culture Rewrote the Hymnal. Each of those was a media ecological way of looking at a liturgical issue. And so my voice is not distinctive because I've studied theology, many people have, nor because I've studied liturgy. It's because I've also studied media ecology. So insofar as I have a distinctive viewpoint, it's because of the convergence of both biblical and theological training on the one hand and media ecological training on the other. And so the powers that be that were putting this weekend together wanted me to address a couple things about our present situation as Christians in the digital age, as it were, regarding Christian discipleship and Christian liturgy. So your two little handouts that you have before you, we won't cover every sentence with equal interest or time. I've also left a few bibliographical suggestions in there. So if any of the ideas at those pertinent points interest you, well, then you can purchase these books and read them. These are good authors that have done some very interesting stuff. So what I'd like to do is to give you a few thoughts about digital media and attention, and then the digital media and the adolescent ghetto, and follow up with some conversation about both of those matters. Media ecology is not a new discipline. It's just a new term for an old human activity. In the Phaedrus dialogue, Socrates objected to manuscripts. The culture that had produced him was an oral culture, and the Homeric poetry that he would have known was passed along orally from generation to generation, and later the person that we call Homer was the person who wrote it in manuscript form, converting it from an oral to a visual reality. Socrates thought it better and wiser to employ orality as a medium rather than manuscript writing by hand. By the way, that's surprising to many of us because the only reason we know about Socrates is because his student Plato disagreed with him and wrote the Phaedrus dialogue down. So there's a wonderful little irony there that Plato thought that manuscripts preserved in writing the heritage of the past better than orality. But the fact that the conversation existed, the fact that Socrates devoted one of his dialogues to that conversation meant already in his day, in an oral culture, as this new medium that we call manuscript or handwriting or chirography came along, there was conversation. Will we be better off as humans or not better off by the introduction of this medium into our culture? So at each important moment in human cultural history as new media were developed, there was a conversation about the merits. And so nothing happened for nearly 3,000 years in terms of media once they started writing by hand until the printing press in the 15th century. And then very little happened for almost 450 years until the late 19th century, when simultaneously two new eras happened, if we can say that, right? And that's because the image era, photograph, and the electronic era, telegraph, were invented within about 4 years of each other in the late 1840s. Now, they were not culturally prevalent until the late 19th century, but because the time between R&D and production was much slower in the late 19th century than it is today. But by the late 19th century, a culture that had been in linguistics since Adam, orality, manuscript, printing press, now has photographs and becomes an image-based culture. And so the balance of communication from language to image shifts like a seesaw on a playground at that point, and we become slightly different people. And of course, the first electronic technology, telegraph, alters forever the relationship between the proximate and the distant. In an oral culture, you can only converse with people within shouting distance. Hey, Bob, right? But with the telegraph, someone in Boston, as long as you know someone who knows Morse code, can communicate virtually in real time with someone in Texas. And so now you start to have communications with people who are a continent away from you, or further. which means you're having fewer conversations with those here. And then within 30 or 40 years, that becomes the telephone. So you don't have to go to the Western Telegraph office and see some little guy with a visor and get him to send your messages. You can actually reach out and touch someone. And so now you're having real-time conversations with people several states away, while of course your wife and children are in the other room not receiving your attention. So the proximate and the distant is forever altered by electronic technologies. When the digital technologies emerged then in the 1990s, they combined the traits of the visual technologies and the electronic technologies, but then took them one step further, a demonic step in my opinion. They made them portable and therefore ubiquitous. And so this has all the attributes of a television in the 1960s, pictures and moving pictures. It has all the attributes of a telephone from the 1960s, right? You can pick it up and call people or text them. But in the 1960s, that produced me, actually the late 50s and 60s, both the television and the telephone were mercifully tethered to a wall somewhere. And like a dog on a leash, one could escape them. Now you can't. It's like having a Doberman in your pocket, right? There he is, and there's no escaping him. And so people are now reflecting, as Socrates did on writing, and as the Roman Catholic Church did on the printing press, because they were not at all happy, and as Marshall McLuhan and Jacques Ellul did on visual technologies and electronic, now we're reflecting on these things. These ubiquitous purveyors of image and distant communication. And so our thoughts are restricted today to those digital technologies. And many of our authors have observed the effect on human attention. The people who study human attention, neurologically or phenomenologically, have noticed that the human has three kinds of attention. Most other animate life has at most two kinds of attention: orienting attention and alarming attention. And orienting attention is when you place any species into a new environment, all of the senses, all five, are just sort of opened up to assess the environment. If you worked for the Parks and Recreation Department and a deer got hit on your property and you had its leg set somewhere and then released it back to the woods after several months, initially, as you let it out of the cage, the deer's nose is very, very busy. With most animals in the wild, the nose is a very, very busy organ because they're sniffing around for water. They need it and we need it. And they're sniffing around for fire. They instinctively do not like the smell of fire. If you live in a forest fire is an unpleasant reality. Right? And so they notice these things. Now see, if you and I want water in the forest, we don't sniff. Our nose is very, very poor. It smells very few things compared to most animate forms of life. Instead, we use the noodle. And we know that gravity causes water to flow downhill. So I tell people who worry about being lost in the woods, right? Because I'm an old hiker. And when they ask me, by the way, have you ever been lost? I say, no, I was confused for 5 or 6 hours once, but never lost. I tell them, when you're lost, it doesn't really matter that you get to where you want to be. It matters that you know how to go downhill. If you go downhill long enough, you'll find water. And eventually someone will find you, because if you've got a brain, they know you've gone downhill. Right? At least charitably, they will assume that you've gone downhill looking for water. And so they will look in the low spots until they find you. So don't worry about being lost. Just enjoy the woods. And if you find yourself confused, find water. And you'll be okay. Well, so we think through these. The deer smells it. They smell water, and they find it that way. So orienting attention is fairly common between most species and the human. And then almost all of our species have extremely well-developed alerting or alarming attention. The only species that survive in the woods learn not to be prey. And the way you learn not to be prey is you notice the sounds, the smells, and the sights of would-be predators. And so you can be munching as a deer on some nice green vegetation, and if you hear someone rack around into a .30-06 rifle, if you're not attentive to that, you're going to end up in someone's stew. And so the only species that have survived, including our species who were once hunter-gatherers, are species which can quickly turn their attention from one thing to another. And so over the course of time, some brains started to secrete dopamine and other pleasure chemicals to the rapid change of attention. And we were actually chemically rewarded for doing so. That's why when people log on to use the internet to look for a piece of information and 30 minutes later find that they are still there, the reason is unknown to them. They are developing a chemical addiction to the sudden change of attention from one thing to another. And that's why people, quote, surf the web. They don't merely look for a particular thing on the web. They stay there linking from one thing to another, unaware that both they and the heroin addict are called user. And there's a reason. Each has a chemical addiction. The brain, however, does not reward us for the one kind of attention we have that no other species has, which is called executive attention. And executive attention is effectively the ability to turn off alarming attention. The ivy-covered towers of academia, for instance. It's designed to be that way because if you are in the woods as a human, you're thinking lions and tigers and bears, oh no. When you're in an academic hall with the doors closed, you don't have to worry about lions and tigers and bears. Just tiny little Greek professors is your only concern once you're in an academic building. And so what happens is, in an academic building, you can think about things like the fundamental theorem of the calculus, or what would have happened had John Wilkes Booth not assassinated President Lincoln, right? Or what might have happened had we not had Jefferson as our third president. We can think about things like how to establish a family budget. We can talk about media ecology. All of these kinds of activities are uniquely human because we alone have executive attention. And so what happens in the digital era is an enormous compromise in the powers of executive attention, because our ubiquitous technologies are literally alarming. We used to reserve that word for its figurative use, right? Gordon's wearing a horizontal tie, how alarming, right? Now we use the adjective alarming literally because our devices do. And what they do is they disrupt our efforts at executive attention. We're working on a spreadsheet for our boss, and we think we can get it done in 45 minutes or so, and we receive 5 or 6 emails, 3 from him asking if we're finished with the spreadsheet, right? And then 2 from someone else in the firm, have you given Bob the spreadsheet yet, right? And so here you're trying to get the spreadsheet to Bob, and everyone's interrupting the spreadsheet production because they're asking about the spreadsheet production. And so you're not concentrating on the task, you're constantly disrupted. And so one of the primary problems that we have right now as we are losing our executive attention, and in the first point before this that's on your handout that I won't say much about, is the brain, because of neuroplasticity or neurogenesis as they call it, the synaptic pathways in the brain are always changing. They are not developed by the time you're 4 or 5 as we used to think. We can now demonstrate through MRIs that if they do a brain scan of you today and another one a year later, it's not the same brain, because new synaptic pathways are being built. And so your brain is much more like a muscle than we once thought. That is to say, it develops itself by adjusting to what it needs to adjust to. So if it's constantly doing 3-minute bursts of attention, it gets good at 3-minute bursts of attention and bad at 3-hour bursts. And the only thing you can do after that is slowly reverse the process and try to go the other direction and retrain it to do executive attention. So we live in a culture of alarmists, the culture of people who quickly go from one thing to another but have a great deal of difficulty focusing. And so what the digital technologies cultivate is distraction. If Neil Postman in 1984 published Amusing Ourselves to Death, his son today should write a sequel entitled Distracting Ourselves to Death. Right? Most of us only think of that in its worst cases, that someone's driving down the interstate texting and drives themselves into another car. literally distracting oneself to death. But there are other forms of distraction that are also killing humane life, at least humane life defined in its richest way. And so you've read them too, I have, the occasional essay in the Washington Times or the New Yorker or elsewhere where someone says, you know, when we used to go on vacation to the beach, I actually looked forward to the occasional rainy day because I would curl up on the couch with a cup of tea or coffee and open a good book and read it. And last summer, when the same event occurred, I opened a book and after 3 or 4 minutes my attention had wandered and I couldn't focus. And I realized I no longer take pleasure in reading a novel. And what they're acknowledging there is their brain has been rewired by the constant digital alerts and alarms that have occurred to them throughout their workaday, so that when they are now enjoying their vacation, one of the great humane things that they used to enjoy, they no longer enjoy. Now the situation, as I say, is not terminal, because you can retrain your brain over time to exercise its executive attention. By the way, I'll cut right to the chase and tell you the easiest way to do that. The simplest way to do it, very simple to do it. Never permit your digital technologies to interrupt you. Develop it as a habit of life that they do not interrupt you. They do not interrupt your labor, Bob's spreadsheet, and they do not interrupt your leisure, reading a book. That is to say, if you think it's proper within God's providence for you to spend 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock reading a novel, read the novel. And then at 4 o'clock, check all of your digital devices. Check them all at once, right? You're already distracting, but do all your distracting at one time, and then let your mind return to whatever it wants to do, uninterrupted for the next hour or 2 or 3, whatever. So whether in your labor or your leisure, you say, well, it's just leisure, it's free time. It's not free time. Your brain never turns off. Your brain is always being adjusted, either to pay attention or not. And so if you permit disruptions, even in your leisure time, you're still rewiring your brain to function in 2 and 3 minute bursts rather than 2 and 3 hour bursts. And so if you want to have a brain that can do those tasks and enjoy those realities that take executive attention, you simply have to resist the distractions. I've been amazed at how frequently people respond to these things as though they were brain surgeons. In fact, sometimes mine's always off, that is to say the alarm is always off audibly, but sometimes seated in my office as someone's chatting with me, they see through my trouser pants that the light has come on, which means it's on vibrate and someone's trying to reach me. And it actually disturbs my students sometimes. They say, somebody's trying to reach you. And I say, you already have. You're in my office, and we're talking, and you're important. And your concerns are important to me. And by the way, I'm not a brain surgeon. No one will die if I don't reach into my pocket. If a Greek student is confused about the tense of a verb, he will not die in the next 3 minutes if I don't respond to him. I might even can wait an hour before I respond to him, and he still will not perish. Right? But many people just assume that if something alerts, I don't know, cosmic karma will go apart if you don't answer it. Right? No, it won't. The world will still be there. God will still be in heaven, and all will be right with the world, whether we drop everything to answer an alarm or not. And so one of the greatest challenges of the digital generation, for all of those who've been studying it, is the atrophy of our executive attention span. And so those who wish to be able to read a novel next year have to at least begin reading a short story uninterrupted tonight. And then they might read 2 or 3 Chekhov short stories the following night. And then before long they're reading a little novelette by Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea, or something else brief. And then give them a couple of years and they've got Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. And they're sitting down on the rainy day at the beach, lost in a 900-page Russian novel. But they've got to start with a Chekhov short story, probably. Right? And if they want to do poetry, don't begin with the epic poems, even though I've mentioned Milton's Paradise Lost that I'm rereading now with great pleasure. You might want to start with Shakespeare's sonnets, 14 lines at a time. Right? For a 21st century brain, a 14-line sonnet might be the best you can do, 3 quatrains and a couplet. Once you get the hang of that, maybe then you can go a little bit further and do some 40 and 50-line poems. and then eventually get to the epic poems. Most of us can't just jump right in and do epic poetry. We've got to do something else. So that's the primary reality about the digital environment for us, but I normally like to say a word or two about its effect on adolescence. And so your second handout addresses that. I call it the adolescent ghetto, informed by others who've studied the matter. People who look at the digital world have now, for about 14 years or 15, talked about two kinds of people, digital immigrants and digital natives. And people my age are called digital immigrants. We grew up in a different world and immigrated to the digital world. So I didn't call my parents long distance in college. AT&T had not been busted up yet, and it cost about $5 for a 3-minute phone call, which in the 1970s was a lot of money. And so I didn't call them once, and they never called me for 4 years. I wrote them a letter every week, and most weeks they wrote back. And I continued to do that for the 3 years in theological seminary studies. So for 7 years, I wrote my parents a letter on a weekly basis and ordinarily received a reply. My papers in college were typed on a typewriter, not a word processor, and in graduate school, I was the second person at the school where I did a PhD to have done a PhD on a computer. And it was an old CP/M 2.02 operating system, a command line interface. No one in this room even knows what a command line interface is, right? I may as well be talking about dinosaurs. So I basically became an adult insofar as I've become one. I basically became an adult in an analog world, and then immigrated at some point gradually into the digital world. Many of you here grew up in the digital world. You are digital natives. And so the digital natives and the digital immigrants tend to look at the world a little differently, because the digital immigrant says, I might do it that way, but it can be done another way. We have a different repertoire of options available to us because we know that certain things can be done in an analog way. If one of my students loses an uncle or an aunt or a grandparent and they have a provost excuse to miss a class, I take my fountain pen out and I write them a handwritten note expressing my sorrow and sympathy with them for losing a loved one. And they often come by within a couple days and thank me and say that no one has ever written them a handwritten letter before, right? And I'm thinking, I wrote my parents letters weekly for 7 years, and they've never received one. So just living in a different, at least it occurs to me that a handwritten note might seem a little more personal than a digital thing that shows up on a screen of glass or plastic. And at least the option is available to me. It doesn't occur to them to do it. It's just not on their arena of opportunities. But what it does especially to the young is it isolates them from adults. All of us, young or old in this room, experienced peer separation anxiety, especially when we were in our teenage years. We did not want to be left out socially when our peers were waiting for the bus at the bus stop, on the bus going to or from school, on the playground during recess. If a group of our peers were hanging around, we wanted to be part of it, and we experienced a little stress if we were excluded from the group. But for the digital immigrants, that only happened when we were in the physical presence of our peers. But you see, in the digital world, someone's always digitally present with someone else. They're always YouTubing and Facebooking and Instagramming and Tumblring and texting and tweeting. And so young people are always nervous that the rest of their peers are carrying on some kind of a digital conversation and they are being excluded. And so to prevent that, they're constantly checking Facebook and Tumblr and other kinds of social networking devices, lest they be separated from their peers. Now, the price they pay for that unwittingly is they rarely overhear an adult conversation. They are constantly either potted up or chicken-headed down, right? And so neither with their eyes or their ears do they notice the adult world. Their conversations and communication. They might be with uncles, aunts, and grandparents on Thanksgiving, but they are only with them in the sense that their Fanny is in the same room as Grandma's Fanny, right? But they are communicating with someone other than Grandma. And so, and when they're on vacation with their parents driving to the beach, well, I don't think you do that often here in Kansas City. You might want to choose another location here. It's a long trip. Maybe just a tornado will take you and Dorothy somewhere else. When we were in trips with our parents growing up, we overheard their conversations. We had AM radio in those days, of course, but a car on a trip runs outside of the antenna range after about 5 or 6, 7 miles, and so it wasn't turned on. And so Mom and Dad might have been in the front seat saying, well, Grandma so-and-so is becoming a little ill now. I wonder if we should have her come stay with us so we can look out for her, or whatever, right? The kind of things adults have to talk about. And as kids, 8, 9, 10, 12, we overheard those conversations. Now, we didn't know what the answer was, but we overheard those. When we became adults, therefore, and faced those kinds of questions, it wasn't the first time we were aware of them. We knew that they were there. But now, the digital environment tends to isolate young people from adults. And so, emerging adulthood, which is a category sociologists now discuss, is recognizing that it takes people 6 to 7 years longer to marry for the first time than they did in 1965. The first marriage is now roughly 28 years old and still instead of roughly 21 years old. Now, there's no reason to be alarmed per se about that, but you can see that if the trend continued for another 50 years, they would now be 31. And another 50 years, they'd be 35 to 36, which is not the safest age for a woman to have her first child. Neither for her or the child, right? So at some point, we have to bear children during the childbearing years. And we can't get infinitely away from the childbearing years and reproduce as a species. So it could eventually become alarming, a matter of concern. But what it really reflects now is it takes young people much longer to mature than they used to, and it's largely because they don't have much adult contact. If a young man wanted to be a carpenter, for instance, he would hang around carpenters. If he wanted to be an auto repairman, he would hang around people who repaired automobiles. Well, young people, if you wish to become an adult, the easiest way to do it is to hang around with an adult, right? You will not become an adult by hanging around with adolescents. It's just not the way life works. And so many of our social observers recognize this. Among the more interesting ones are Christian Smith at Notre Dame. He used to be at UNC. So if you say, I thought Christian Smith was at Chapel Hill, you're not mistaken. He was at Chapel Hill, but has been at Notre Dame now for 6 or 7, 8 years. Both he and Mark Bauerlein at Emory University are astute students of this reality. And one of the things that Christian Smith says is one of the striking features of emerging adulthood is how structurally disconnected most emerging adults are from older adults. Most emerging adults live this crucial decade of their life surrounded mostly by their peers. People who have no more experience, insight, wisdom, perspective, or balance than they do. It is sociologically a very odd way to help young people come of age to learn how to be responsible, capable, mature adults. And the way Dr. Bauerlein at Emory put it is, a different social life and a different mental life have formed among them. Technology has bred it. Instead of opening young American minds to the stores of civilization and science and politics, technology has contracted their horizon to themselves, to the social scene around them. Young people have never been so intensely mindful of and present to one another, so enabled in adolescent contact. Teen images and songs, hot gossip and games, and youth-to-youth communications, no longer limited by time or space, wrap them up in a generational cocoon. And so the World Wide Web, I suggest, for young people is the world narrow web. It's, by the way, that way for adults too, because the Google algorithms know what you want to find when you run a search, and they are calculated to take you where you've already been. That's why when two of you Google the same thing on 2 different computers, you don't get the same answer from Google. Because Google tailors its answer for commercial reasons to take you places where they know you all already want to be. So the World Wide Web has already become the world narrow web in the last 7 years. 3 years ago, you know, it passed television for commercial revenue. There's more commercial revenue expended on the internet now, and has been for 3 years, than on television. So the World Wide Web is now the world commercial web, And commercial forces don't want to take you in areas that you might not purchase. They want to take you where you're already comfortable. So the internet already narrows almost all of us, but it especially narrows young people. The digital world places them, as Bauerlein says, in a digital cocoon, or as I call it, the adolescent ghetto. They become ghettoized. Now, young people are neat. I kind of like them. They're energetic. I teach them, so I have a certain toleration for it, right? Even have a few happy memories of having been one time. All right. However, it's only about a third of our life that we are pre-adults, and if we live a normal 80, 3/4 of our life is adult. And so if you're going to spend 3/4 of your life as a carpenter, you may as well learn to carpentry early. Right? And if you're going to spend 3/4 of your life as an adult, you may as well learn to do it early. And the way to do it is by interacting with people who are also said adults. And the digital world tends not to do that. And then I always toss out this little thing, by the way, you can study this Roman numeral 4 if you're interested further. The traditional youth ministry probably makes the problem worse. It ghettoizes youth. Right? In a culture where even secular analysts are saying the problem our young people face is their isolation from adults. Well, we take them to church for the solution, and the church has a special ministry that isolates them from adults. Well, now wait a minute. That doesn't strike me as the cure. So if that troubles or intrigues or interests you, I published a little thing last spring with Greg Reynolds, The Ordained Servant. It's a ministry of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, designed for deacons and elders and ministers, where they study things a little bit more acute than they would in the New Horizons, I think. It's a little more demanding. And so I had a little paper on have we reached the point where youth ministry needs to stop? And I don't think we necessarily have, but it either needs to stop or we need to completely retool what we're doing. We first need to rename it and call it adolescent ministry, because the word adolescent in English suggests a kind of awkwardness, doesn't it? Youth is at least neutral, if not positive. Right? But it's an awkward age, so why not call it what it is? Right? If I had tuberculosis and my physician said, you're short of breath, I said, well, no, I think it's tuberculosis. That's more serious than short of breath. I'm short of breath when I walk up the stairs. Tuberculosis is not walking up the stairs. It's a different kind of a thing, for crying out loud. So also, if we called youth ministry adolescent ministry, we would at least label it as the difficult transitional moment that it is. Secondly, for content, everything we do with it, I mean virtually everything, should be designed to become an adult. How to find a spouse. How to be the kind of person that another Christian would want as a spouse. How to create a family budget, right? How to rear children, right? In other words, the sooner we can help younger people to think about where they will live for 60 years, adults, the better off. So if we must have an isolating ministry, let's call it by the right name and do there the right things. But possibly we've reached the cultural moment where we really need to rethink the thing altogether. Is isolating at church an already isolated group to their advantage? Or is it to their disadvantage? And should we consider reintroducing them to the adults with whom they will spend the majority of their human life if they live to a ripe old age? So that's a very disturbing thing. And when people talk about you're putting something online, my thing on youth ministry, on the ordained servants, and they say, how many hits are you getting? And I say, well, I'm getting a lot of both kinds. Right? The people are reading it and they're not happy about it. And so I'm getting all sorts of hits from that one, as is my custom. And if you're interested in that matter, you can read further about it. But those are my general thoughts of the digital distracted world and the unusual, peculiar problem it causes by isolating young people from adults. Something that we hardly notice. In my generation, we as adolescents were noticed because we did the craziest things. We were the 60s Woodstock hippie Jesus freak generation. And if we weren't burning down an academic building, we were considering doing so, right? And if we weren't studying at Kent State, we were protesting at Kent State, and so forth. So our imperfections were very noticeable. They were loud and extreme. We wore funny clothes and behaved in peculiar ways, and our music was loud, and people complained. But when young people are potted up, we don't complain about their loud music or even notice that it is, or that it is different. And so now young people sort of fly under the adult radar. We hardly notice them. We can't make eye contact with them because they're doing this. We can't make auditory contact with them because they're potted up most of the time wherever they are. And then they in turn have very few communications with us. And so we find ourselves in an awkward moment where the older members of the human race who once aided younger members by inviting them into adulthood can't get their attention. And the only one that has their attention are fellow young people. So that becomes a very interesting thing that's happening. We're glad that our daughters are now grown, one married, one about to be, because this wouldn't have been the easiest era in which to make decisions about, do I get a smartphone for my 8-year-old, or my 12-year-old, or my 14-year-old? And there's two parties to the conversation that want the answer to be soon. There's the person, the child, and then there's Apple or anyone else. All right. The commercial forces, of course, want you to have 4 people on your digital plan, not 2. And so the earlier they can get 4 people on your plan, the happier they are. And so obviously they are not urging restraint in any of these areas. And the young people aren't, because once one of their friends is digitally connectable, they want to be able to connect to them. And so it requires a great deal of wisdom in child rearing today simply to make the decision of how long do I forego the digital environment, and what restrictions and restraints do I put on it once we're there. And we certainly cannot give wise counsel to young people on these matters if we ourselves permit our own digital devices to disrupt and interrupt us whenever they darn well please. If we haven't learned to manage them in a humane fashion, we cannot expect to set examples for how others manage them in a humane fashion. We just can't do it. And so it's an interesting moment. In most moments in human history, each generation could learn from the previous. Were my parents living, however, they couldn't give me advice on the digital world because they didn't live in it. And I can barely do it for our children because they're grown now. And if we are ourselves swallowed up in it and haven't learned what to do with it, now there's no one really around to help us. We don't have previous generations. When we talk about how to pray, we can read books by C.H. Spurgeon or John Calvin or Martin Luther. There are many humane questions where we can solicit the wisdom of the past, what to do with the disruptive, adolescent, ghettoizing, digital technologies. We have no one to look to because these are all very new and we have no wisdom from the past to inform us. All we can do then is begin to have a conversation with one another. That's what I'm doing this morning. We begin to have a conversation and begin to chat with one another about it. We include this as part of the other conversations we have as Christians in our Christian discipleship. Several people suggest that I write another book in the Why Johnny Can't series. If I do it, I'll have an outline for it. Why Johnny Can't Listen. Because that actually, liturgically, is an interest of mine, like why Johnny can't preach and why Johnny can't sing hymns. And I'm wondering, with attenuated attention spans, what that means for listening. And you say, well, listening, that's an inconsequential religious matter. It is not. What do you hear in every Jewish synagogue every Saturday, whether Reformed or Orthodox? Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. What happens when the people of God can no longer hear the ministry of word or sacrament with benefit or understanding? I think it is a liturgical question, and all of the cultural factors are moving against our ability to do that. Even our Westminster Confession of Faith in chapter 21, when it talks about the lawful elements of Christian worship, when it gets to the portion about the Word of God, it says, the reading, preaching, and conscionable hearing of the Word of God. A lovely little quaint adjective, conscionable. We may be on figuring out what conscionable hearing is. We first have to learn to hear, and then wrestle with the question of conscionable hearing. But it considers it an act of worship, conscionable hearing. If we are a generation whose capacities to hear are truncated, then surely our capacities to hear conscionably are also truncated. So if I have the opportunity, Jeff, that's the next little volume, Why Johnny Can't Hear. As something to the effect of how digital technologies have killed the Shema, or something like that, we might find.